She's currently working on a collaborative project and has begun her second novel. So let's welcome Rachel.
So I've been hearing about 25 Eastern Parkway for a while. It's really great to be here. It's really great to be fed. Thank you. Yeah. Yay!
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, there's soup. There's amazing soup.
Something there. And I'm thinking that this is a benefit, in addition to being a salon and they're so clear about that the gesture is about building relation and connection and network, but it's also a benefit. And I started Belladonna not as a collaborative, just as a little project out of my pocket, because I wanted to contextualize myself in 1999, and so I started an avant-garde feminist reading series in the United States, because those two things weren't being articulated together as they were in maybe Canada or some other places. But and so I did it because I was both of those things, and they were coming together for me, and I needed them to come together in the world. And then it grew, and at this point, it is a collaborative, and I'm not a director or manager. I'm really just a part of it, and that was an interesting process also. But the focus more and more has become in how to sort of be autonomous and how to do work that also sustains life. And so the program that Christian is a coordinator of and that I work at, the MFA in writing at Pratt, it supports this kind of autonomy, and this project is just the epitome in some ways of possibility and beauty and engagement. So I do support the project, but also I'm just putting out there for us to think about money and more creatively and more sustainably on the left about how we take care of ourselves and each other and confront the systems of money and power in new ways. I haven't gotten very far. I'm going to read from Reno Emos, and I like to tell a little story about Reno Emos, which is that the letters come from Hebdomeros. It's a De Chirico novel and surrealist novel, and it's anonymously translated. So I moved the letters around, came up with Reno Emos, and Google searched Reno Emos to see what it meant, or if it existed, and it didn't. What came up was Reno Moms, which was funny. And then I published this little tiny book, 100 copies, which I'm going to read from partly because no one's ever read it, because only 100 copies went out, and I took a bunch of them. But regardless of how little impact the actual writing made on the world, it changed the Google search forever. This is from inside of it. It's sort of a story about it's a negotiating country-city life in this part. The letters get mixed up again. Eros Amasor. The town awoke and I resisted it. I take pleasure in the strength. The entire close-quartered workings begun early, even on days devoted to lazy social behavior in the bed or on the street, to going to pray and to wearing a hat. I know when Reno Emos is watching me, even though I can only just occasionally catch a glimpse of him, perceiving him in his funny suit, which each time shows up a little less brilliantly, in a different place, like some sort of surrealist looking for an occasion. Eventually, this town settles down into routine workings after the morning's eruption of arrivals and beginnings. Then its quiet is softer than country reserve, effeminate and made of waste. There is a deep perversity to the act of sleeping in. Although Reno Emos is a committed and inveterate peeping Tom, he'd hate to be characterized that way. We who are interested in him know this and don't say such things to his face. Although I am not sure if I am such one, interested in Reno Emos in the sense of a mutual future, I think about him. I overheard him that day speaking of the sun and the streetlights and the varying deepness which each source of penetrating bright light enters the well of the tenement through the windows. But if the windows were themselves a source of light, the scenario was not analogous at all. Once he saw a great leg that became a couple of women making love, which lasted until he looked away. It was no longer there when he returned to see more, so he moved on to a diatribe about experimental rhythms, saying some crap about how you couldn't invite a woman into your improvisation and expect to play. She'd have no sense of the time-space manifest intrinsic to expansive sound. Because, ventured Reno Emos, women are too anxious about their next move. None of the men present chimed into the conversation with Reno, but they nodded in a sort of relief that someone was saying something to validate their curious frustration with the ladies, even as they were mostly uncertain about the accuracy. I considered what Reno Emos was saying, and though I can't associate his logic to the world as I know it, I spent time applying the seriousness of my thought to his spiteful rant. My time was wasted. For Reno Emos and every other frightened man-boy, these malevolent elaborations make no sense in any world, but justify the terror that gasses out of their acute desire for each other, combined with their lack of verbal synchronicity. Reno Emos couldn't settle down and undo his shoes until the couple above him quieted and made their bed. He had a thing about order. One thing had to be completed before another was begun. Reno Emos nearly got slammed by a police car as he was jaywalking. From its bullhorn, he was warned to be more careful. Foolishly, he continued to jaywalk, thinking they would likely arrest him for it and ask him what was he thinking, or tell him he was not thinking right. Why did he hate them so? The singular goal of the security apparatus is to produce fear. Yet fear, like an annoying fly or proselytizing missionary, doesn't stick very well to the bodies in this town, never mind in the country where we set ourselves up for the sole purpose of refusal. I see the morning scene of lovemaking as only one example. The fear pushed out then exists and proliferates as loose matter in the air which can gather like a cloud, and so his car on the metro was particularly hostile. Did he smell? Was that person looking at the spot by his earlobe? He was nervous. I'm going to read a chapter from this novel. I call this a novel, and it was never really very accepted as a novel by the fiction places I've been. But anyway, and John, there's a nice quote from John Ashbery that actually worried me. Sheila says, I worry that my poetics in some ways she has a new form for introductions that centers around worry. So I worried about this John Ashbery blurb because I was saying it's a novel, and then when he wrote, sort of did this thing around poetry, but I've ended up really liking it. He says, Rachel Levitsky's prose poems employ the elegant language of philosophical inquiry to probe a territory not unlike the domain of poetry. So basically what he says is, these prose poems are not unlike poetry. Made me very happy. So this is a chapter that Sheila taught, and so it's for Sheila and for the essays that came. Okay. I guess since this is a novel, I should say something about the plot. There are a group of people that come into the world all at once and all one way. And they are trying to figure out many things, but the primary thing they're trying to figure out is how to have emotions. Happiness. Expressionlessness and boredom do little to portray the energy of the work demanded of us by a difficult navigation of signs, a cacophonous multitude pointing toward us and into every direction around us, composed of straight lines jutting into the projectile points of two line-drawn arrows, or of shaded and curved and crooked trajectories gathering into dimensional representations of a nasty, long, bony index finger, a witch's hooking gesture. Both in their own way were ominous enough to suggest unspeakable punishment if we did not obey their crisscrossed instructions to traverse narrowly, or was it circuitously, along paths poised to suggest a multiplicity, but which would then authoritatively combine us and the variety of paths on which we'd begun multiply, seemingly randomly, even dreamily, into one definitively singular march. Beyond and in addition to the demands of the ubiquitous rebus of these tangled 2- and 3-dimensional surfaces disguised as helpful state infrastructure and technological convenience, was yet another demanding superstructural shove, so strong and everywhere that it was like gravitational force into the discovery, production, and distribution of happiness. According to Aristotle, evil is opposed to evil. Our greatest oppositions originate from the forms with which they are most alike. Happiness was far from the only word entity that was used in phenomenologically diverse manners by people who spoke the same language and were in the same room. Some words were themselves defined so in the glossary to mean both themselves and their opposites or near opposites. We were alarmed by such words, so collected them. Some of the most disturbing remain on our list of words we find ourselves unwilling to circumnavigate without. Address, against, beauty, bolt, cleave, disintimate, gift, girlfriend, incorporate, infamous, let, me, move, object, oversee, project, rap, ravel, root, sanction, strike, weather, and many others, including foreign words like Gehinstat or Heimlich and Unheimlich, which you can read more about in the chapter, The Story Around My Accident. Like the sphere epidemic, coincidentally or not, the happiness problem arrived at the critical climax of our becoming the project, during which we've begun to experience ourselves as cohesive, and better still, in possession of a concentrated intent on action and activity. In other words, at the very moment within which we were beginning to stir things up, the state, in all its earnestness and productivity, having become gravely concerned that the erasures and the subsequent evenness was producing a massive and profit-crippling ennui among its people, initiated the release of a happiness campaign, whose earmark was an omnipresent billboard that read, "Happiness for all beings." At first, these signs read happiness for all people, no matter color, class, or creed. Beside the obvious troubles with the poetry of the phrase, which issued from a well-intentioned but misguided desire to articulate its revolutionary, progressive, and democratic commitments, its election campaign slogan had been, "All things to all people." There were complaints. The spiritualists who, to our surprise, had become a tightly organized activist force in our time, launched their own campaign by way of constant media of every sort, at all hours, every day. Their numbers were, by this time, vast, to merely change the phrasing slightly so that beyond the limitation set by the word people, the slogan would include all things. For they, the spiritualists, understood as we did that language has meaning. Thus, a slight change in the wording of this governmental campaign could move people's consciousness, could in fact be radical, even in its own religious right. A change in the phrasing such, by this slight edit, would mean shifting orientation from a state advertisement that amounted to something like a happiness propaganda to a polite request to consider a different notion of consciousness. And though we were a bit mocking of the spiritualists for their funny science, we were impressed by this coup, that without a levy, they had essentially gotten the state to do their bidding. Some of us, alcoholics and suicides, were so impressed, we made an attempt to join the spiritualists ourselves, logically reasoning this could for us, quote, kill two birds with one stone, end quote, and knew better than to repeat this idiom in the presence of our new community, which espoused a reverence for all beings and would find such lackadaisical and cruel language behavior, if not irredeemable, something which would require a corrective treatment, or to put it less disruptively and into the language habit of the spiritualists themselves, it provided a win-win situation. Not only were they effective politically, their program suggested interruption against the exact vulnerabilities we feared we were most subject to, us as alcoholics, us as suicides, and us as the rest. It didn't work. It wasn't the very same vulnerabilities among them and us all. The happiness the spiritualists offered made us feel lethargic and dumb, which was the very situation we've been trying our whole lives living this world to diagnose, and if not cure, at least improve with dialogue and great attempts for the invention of difference, derived from our pained longing for a change of some sort, the possibility of which seems to defy logic. For how could we become other than as we were, especially since we were, following the design planned by both us and them, all one way? But it persisted in us, this notion that if we made heroic effort and stayed the course, which course would it be, and cared a very great deal about it, then at least an incremental alteration might build us and the world in which we found ourselves, and that would be enough, all that were necessary, however little it'd be.